I've got my two side pieces cut out. It took me a little bit, but I eventually figured out the right measurements where I need to make some lines. So I've already made the measurements on this piece. Now I'm going to take these together so that I can transfer the measurements from here to here instead of having to measure it again. I did have problems with painter's tape earlier, but it should be okay this time because it's not going to stay on as long. Okay, now we have one of the tricky bits. I've marked off where the back of each vertical piece is going to be. So I started 3/16 of an inch, which is the thickness of my foam core, and then gone back from there and marked every 1.25 inches plus another 3/16 of an inch. So I've marked those off along here, and I've marked on the other side coming in from this side, and then I did it at the top as well. So now I know where the backs of each vertical piece are going to be. The horizontal marks I made earlier will give us the bottoms of the support pieces that are going to be attached to the side here, holding up the ends of the bottom pieces where the paints are going to sit. In order to figure out where everything's going to go now, I need to follow the diagonal pattern, mark those off. In order to do that, I'm going to start by doing some faint pencil marks roughly where I want them to be. Should be fairly safe. I'm just going to eyeball it until I get in the right neighborhood, and then I'm going to come back with my Sharpie and get the really precise lines where I need them. Now I've got pencil marks along here that are showing me roughly where the back pieces are going to be. So I'm going to come over and do it on the other side as well. Now I'm going to come back and do the same sort of horizontal marks. It's a lot easier if you line up your straight edge above the marks because you've just put pencil lines below. So you're going to have a good reference point for approximately how far over these need to be. Now that I've got that marked out, I'm going to come back and erase the pencil lines that go too far up. I don't think they're going to show, but just in case. Just to make sure I got everything lined up properly, I'm going to use my straight edge and make sure that my diagonal step pattern here roughly follows in a line. It's a good thing I did that. I noticed that I'd actually drawn this line coming out the wrong way. So just to make sure that I'm not going to get it wrong again, I'm going to come back, fix that, and erase this one. Now that we've marked everything out, we know what areas are safe to mark in. Anything that's inside of these corners we know is never going to be seen because it's behind a back piece or below a bottom. So we can extend the lines as far as we want this way, and we're not going to have to worry about it showing up. We want the lines to be longer because we're going to use these as reference for some more support pieces. And now the same thing for the verticals, but I'm not going to bother recording that because it's just more of the same. For the vertical lines, the support blocks are going to go on the inside, so I'm going to mark that. When I'm gluing in support blocks in a minute, I'm going to make sure that I cover the X's with the support blocks. For these horizontal lines, it's different. These are actually marking the bottoms of the support blocks. So there's going to be the line, the support block on top of it, and then on top of that is where the bottom pieces are going to be sticking out. So once again, just marking some little X's. So once again, I'm just going to cover these X's with little blocks that I've got cut. Now you might be wondering why I decided to do it this way, so that I've got some of the pieces going on the inside and some on the outside. The reason for that is because these horizontal pieces are actually going to go pretty much the full width. So if we put these on the inside and then put these below, we'd have to have another mark to say, well, don't put a vertical piece within this area. So we just have more lines on here. Doing it this way avoids drawing extra lines, and as long as we have little X's there, we know where everything's got to go. So I've cut myself a bunch of 2-inch support blocks. They're going to get glued in along the vertical lines. They're a little bit shorter, but they don't need to be a precise width, so that's okay. And I've laid them out where each one is approximately going to go. I've also got slightly shorter pieces that are going to be going along here, and I want to make sure that I don't accidentally use one of the short pieces along here, because then I'll have a long piece that I'm trying to use that's not going to have enough space here, and then I'll have to go cut some more pieces, and it's going to be a big pain in the neck, and I don't want to do any more work than I have to. One thing to be careful of is to make sure that the very front of your horizontal support pieces are lined up with the line below it. The reason for that is that you're going to have a vertical piece coming in here, and if you don't give it space, it's got nowhere to go. And I just realized I made a mistake. I don't need pieces up here. I need pieces down here. The paint is dry and the glue is dry. It's time to put everything together. The challenge is that until we get everything all glued together, these pieces are not going to be very stable. Until we get these pieces stable, it's going to be hard to glue everything together. So I'm going to have to try to find some ways around that. Here's what I've come up with. I'm going to stand these pieces up so the paint stand is effectively sitting on its back, and then I'm going to take some scrap pieces of wood and use them to hold these pieces upright, and they should stay fairly stable while I do the assembly. To figure out where everything's going to go, I'm going to use some of the bottom pieces to just sort of mark everything out to get about the right distance. I can see I definitely need to separate these a bit. So this looks like about the right distance for here. Let's make sure I got everything lined up. And it's a little bit of a gap there, so if I bring that together, we should be good. The next thing I need to make sure of is that these pieces aren't offset from each other one way or the other. What I'm going to do is take this and put it at the bottom. This piece is going to be flat up against here. This edge is going to be against the very bottom of this side. And I'll just make sure that this piece is just touching the bottom of this side. I can't seem to get a good camera angle to film this. Every time I've tried, I've ended up with my own head in the road or something, and it just looks ridiculous. So I'm afraid for this part, you're just going to have to go with my description. Sorry about that. I've got everything set up about right, so now I need to start gluing things in. I'm going to take one of these pieces and get it on, I think, the third step. Doesn't really matter where, somewhere sort of middle-ish is probably fine. It's just to start establishing that things are in more or less the right place. I got my glue. You don't want to put a ton of glue on there, you want just enough to hold everything together, but not be stuck dealing with a ton of squeeze out. So with the glue in place, bring this in. What you want to do here is line up this bottom support with the side pieces for each bottom. That way when you glue the bottom on, you know that it's all going to be fairly even and steady. Now we're going to let this sit just long enough for this to sort of tack up and get a little bit more stable. As I was trying to glue this together last night, the side pieces kept trying to pull apart at the top. So what I ended up having to do was take a clamp and clamp the whole thing closed. You have to make sure that you get the clamping pressure right across this piece. Otherwise it just squishes the sides in instead of holding it where it's supposed to be. And the other thing was the clamps kept trying to knock the whole thing over, so I've got some blocks of wood underneath to hold it in place. While I was waiting for other stuff to glue together last night, I came back and added some support blocks to keep this front piece from just wobbling back and forth the whole time. Luckily, I didn't actually glue the front piece into place at the same time, because I realized if I had, I would now have no way of putting the bottom piece in place because the support blocks would be keeping it from getting in there. But I did leave just enough space to slide this thing in. So what I'm going to have to do, slide that in, then glue the front piece in place. The rest of these pieces don't have any extra support for the fronts, so I can just bring the bottom pieces down from above and just set them carefully into place, a little bit more carefully than that. Back pieces keep wanting to curl up. The white glue doesn't seem to be holding them down properly, so I'm using some super glue. It does take a little bit of time to set up. It's not instant, unfortunately. So to hold everything in place while the glue is drying, what I've done is laid this thing on its back, put in a bit of the super glue, and then I took my templates, or one of my templates, set it across the width, and then just a couple scrap blocks of wood. They're not particularly big. It's just enough to add a bit of weight to hold everything in place for a few minutes while the super glue dries. Everything's had a chance to set up now, so I'm going back to putting the bottom pieces on. I'm going to switch to using super glue because I find I have to hold some of these things in place while I'm working on them. And if I'm trying to sit there holding it in place long enough for white glue to dry, that's going to take forever. And I don't really have good access to clamp things together, so hopefully the super glue will dry fast enough to do the trick. Everything's had a chance to set up, so now it's time to trim the side pieces to the right side. And to get a nice diagonal, I want a little bit of extra material above all these pieces. I don't want the trim line to be right on each of these. The main reason for that is that if I try to put it right on that line, I know they're not perfectly lined up, so I'm going to end up with some of them looking a little bit off. If I bring it up a little bit, it gives me a little bit of wiggle room, and everything should look reasonably consistent. So all I'm going to do is come up about 3/4 of an inch. And conveniently, I already have a line in the right place here. I'm going to do the same thing up here. And flip it over to the other side. That line's in the right place. I'm going to bring back out my cutting guide here. Line it up. This is going to be kind of a pain to cut. I'm just going to go back through, finish the cut. One last cut. All I'm going to do is line this up with the top of the back piece here, cut back here, and then come over to the other side and try to continue that cut. Now that I've got this all cut out, I'm deciding that I need to trim the back a little bit. It's just a little bit too deep back here. You can see I've got quite a bit of space in behind the back piece, and I don't really need that. It's just going to be wasting space on my desk. I'd made these pieces a little oversized just to make sure I had enough material, which clearly I have, so I'm going to get rid of the extra. Here we go, the project's complete. I've got my paint stand sitting on my desk loaded up with all my old Citadel paints. I've got quite a bit more clear space on my desk now, which is pretty handy. I think I need another one of these, but I'm not thrilled with the way the texture ended up making the back pieces there curl. It makes the whole thing a little bit less stable. It means some of the paints don't fit in well. It's a huge pain in the neck to assemble. I think it looks pretty darn cool, but I don't know if it's really worth it. So for the other one, I'm just going to go ahead and use just flat foam core and see what happens.